Today on Network Africa, the UN is warning that countries turning refugees away from Europe is not the answer to the crisis on the continent. Then, counting down to the strike action threatened by Nigeria Labour Congress, the federal government is trying to stall Labour's action. Also, the 69th edition of the Cannes Film Festival has begun. How much of a participation is Nigeria making? Network Africa begins right now. Hello everyone, glad you could join us. I am Amarachi Ubani. Before we delve into today's stories, let's check in on other major headlines on the continent this weekend.
Regional governments, including Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Benin and Cameroon, gathered in Abuja to discuss strategies to fight Boko Haram. Western governments worry that Islamic State's growing presence in North Africa and ties with Boko Haram could erode a push south into the vast, lawless Sahel region and create a springboard for wider attacks. The security summit hosted by Nigeria was also attended by French President Francois Hollande, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond. Then, days after the announcement of increase in Nigeria fuel price, the price of commodities across different sectors is already witnessing a new wave of inflation, while the Labour Union Congress, which represents workers across the country, said it would resist the hike by embarking on a strike.
The fuel increments come by suddenly. I used to use 3,000 something to fuel my car, but now it's 7,000 something. Then how do I go? And the 2 days I have run the fuel. So I'm not really happy. The salary are not increased, but everything at the market was increased.
Finally, Egyptian courts sentenced more than 152 protesters to jail on Saturday for a recent demonstration against the decision to transfer two Red Sea islands to Saudi Arabia. They were detained after demonstrating, and most have been sentenced to 5 years in prison. The protest broke out on April 15 after President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi ceded two islands in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. Under el-Sisi's rule, restrictions on protest have been tightened, and protesting without a police permit carries jail time. The protest broke out on April 15 after President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi ceded two islands in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. Under el-Sisi's rule, restrictions on protest have been tightened, and protesting without a police permit carries jail time. But how much jail time seems to depend on the judge. In one court, 51 defendants were jailed for 2 years. In another, 101 people were given 5 years, the maximum sentence. The government says the police, prosecutors and courts are merely applying the law. But lawyers for the defense disagreed. According to protesters, police have also been inconsistent in their approach to the arrest.
The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, is warning Europe that turning away refugees will not solve the crisis on the continent. He said the burden had become greater on the few countries taking in refugees and that more countries needed to shoulder the responsibility. He said last year, fewer than 1% of 20 million refugees had resettled in another nation. Mr. Grandi, who took up the position as High Commissioner in January this year, said the fact that Syrians were arriving in East Asia and in the Caribbean as refugees showed how global the phenomenon has become, and therefore, quote, we have to have global responses. He said the burden of caring for refugees had so far fallen on a few countries that host hundreds of thousands of refugees, usually those near wars, near conflicts, and a few donors that alone, 7 or 8 of them, give about 80 to 90% of the funding.
And we as citizens disagree and think that Turkey is not a safe country for some migrants and refugees. then we may have to challenge the policies that try to enforce the blocking of the border for all migrants and refugees.
Meanwhile, the UN Special Envoy for the Refugee Agency, Angelina Jolie, has added her voice in warning that the international humanitarian system for refugees is breaking down. She warned against the fear of migration and a race to the bottom as countries competed to be the toughest to protect themselves. The UN is preparing an event dedicated to migration and the effect it is having on the world. Among the range of speakers scheduled for the event is Special Envoy Angelina Jolie, as well as former British Secret Intelligence Chief Sir Richard Dearlove. To security issues, the Nigerian army says it has arrested members of the Niger Delta Avengers militant group, which has claimed responsibility for a wave of attacks on pipelines in the restive Niger Delta region. Reuters news agency is quoting the Director of Defense Information, Brigadier General Rabi Abubakar, saying the detainees were arrested in connection with attacks on Chevron oil facilities. The militants claim to be fighting for a greater share of oil profits, an end to pollution and independence for the Niger Delta. When we come back after the break on Network Africa, the rise in pump price of fuel and Labour's impending strike action coming into focus. Do stay with us.